Hi, Professor. Hi, classmates. I hope you are all fine and safe. So, today's presentation is concerning the 5th class of Sociolinguistics course, and it concerns itself with address forms. The first part, as you have seen, was devoted to defining address forms and the forms of address forms. And in this part, I'm going to summarize some studies that are conducted on address forms. So if you look at the outline, I have two main points I'm going to tackle. The first one is the European address system, and I will rely on Bron and Gilman Study. And the second is the American address system, and we have two studies, one by Bron and Fold, and the second by Ervin-Tripp. So concerning the European address system, Bron and Gilman conducted a study 1960 and 1972, and their study is considered as the classical and the most influential study of address form and social relationships. So they attempt to investigate the use of second-person pronoun in languages like French, German, Italian, and Spanish. Concerning the methods used, they relied on informal interviews. Also, they relied on the analysis of works of literature, especially drama, and they have also results of survey questionnaires. And they focused on two independent variables, namely power and solidarity. So let's see one by one. And before I start, I will be using T and V letters. I would like to remind you that V is the term that Bron and Gilman use to designate the differential pronouns in any of the languages, taking the first letter from the Latin vos, that is associated with the more powerful, and T is the familiar pronoun from Latin tu, just as we have in French vous and tu. But we will see this in more details. And to start, the first independent variable is the power pronoun semantic. First, the term semantic refers to the covariation between the pronoun used and the objective relationship between the speaker and the addressee. First, this power pronoun semantic is non-reciprocal, just like power relationships. Why it is not reciprocal? Because two people cannot have power over each other in the same area. And in the same way, the power semantic governs the non-reciprocal use of the two pronouns. So the least powerful person says V to the more powerful and receives T. This power semantic would be sufficient only if a society were so finely stratified that each individual has an asymmetrical relationship with every other individual, which means that there were no power equals, right? And since this was never the case, at least in Europe, a residual rule for power equals was necessary. And this rule called for a reciprocal use of the same power or the same pronoun between power equals. So the V form was associated with the noble classes and they originally address each other with mutual V. On the other hand, T form is used among the common people, power equals. Now we move to the solidarity semantic. Solidarity implies a sharing between people, a degree of closeness and intimacy. So solidarity came from the need developed to distinguish a degree of common ground between people, which went beyond simply having equal power. So according to Bron and Gilman, solidarity came into play only when it did not interfere with the power semantic. So it would be used between power equals. If two people are equally powerful but not solidary, which means they don't share anything significant like family background or origin in the same village and so on, they would exchange V, just as the noble classes did before the solidarity semantic was developed. But the difference was that now mutual V would be used between non-solidary equals, either among common people or among nobles. Okay? So if power equals were solidary, they will exchange mutual T, even if they were members of the high class. Now let's have a look at figure 1 to illustrate this more. This figure was taken from the chapter we relied on in this presentation. So here we have the two-dimensional semantic in equilibrium. We have solidarity and we have power, which is superior or inferior. So the speaker first determines power relationships. If a person is more powerful, he or she gives T and expects to receive V, right? If a person is less powerful, then he or she will give V and get T. But if there is no power difference, then the speaker decides if he or she and the other person are solidary. If so, they both will use T. If not, they will use V. However, these power and solidarity can conflict. For example, parents and children could be more solidary. So mutual T will be used, okay? And the children call their parents by T. But the power semantic would lead a child to address his or her parents with using V form. And here we have this figure showing the two-dimensional semantic and their tension. Okay, so look at the middle section of the figure. They are identical with those of figure 1. Alright, so there is no problem in selecting the pronoun. But in the top right quadrant, we have both power and solidarity indicate that the superior and the non-solidary addressee should receive V. Okay, this is okay. Similarly, in the lower left quadrant, both power, solidarity to the inferior and solidary addressee. In the lower left quadrant, both power and solidarity call for T to the inferior and solidary addressee, right? However, look at the upper left quadrant. The addressee is superior, right? So she should receive V. But it is also solidary. Right? Here is a problem. And also the opposite conflict surfaces in the lower right quadrant. Now we move to the American English Address. So this address system of American English in particular has been analyzed by Bron and Fold and by Ervin-Tripp. And each of these studies has become something of a classic. The principal choices in American English are between first name and title with last name, with first name roughly analogous to title and title last name to the form. In Bron and Fold study, 1961-1964, they used a variety of data in their investigation, of which forces influences this choice. They used literary sources, right? Like they focused on modern American plays. They also had records of more than 200 interactions involving about 80 people in Boston drafting firm. In addition, they had records of observations involving some 56 children in the American Midwest for psychology research project on another topic. So we focus here on two forms, the first name and the title last name. There are three patterns possible with the two forms, right? The first one, the natural exchange of first name, including such common nicknames like Bob or Jim. Second pattern is the mutual exchange of title last name. So we have people who exchange title last name and the titles like Mr., Doctor, Miss, Mrs., etc. And the third pattern is the non-reciprocal pattern in which one person gives the first name and receives the title last name. So let's look at these patterns in details. So according to Bron and Fold, the two reciprocal patterns are governed by a single dimension ranging from acquaintance to intimacy. So an American calls someone they are, or Americans call someone they are merely acquainted with by title last name, and they expect the same in return. However, people who are friends call each other by their first name. The non-reciprocal pattern, on the other hand, is governed by two dimensions, age and occupation status. For example, age, a person who is older will be called by title last name and call the younger using the first name. Concerning the occupation status, for example, a person with a higher occupational status had privilege of being addressed with title last name, while addressing the older with first name. So we can see here that Bron and Fold results are remarkably similar to the earlier study of Bron and Gilman on T and V. So the mutual exchange of first name, like the mutual exchange of T. And when we have the absence of sufficient solidarity, but with no difference in power, we have the mutual title last name will be used. Similarly, like mutual V. Bron and Fold also made a number of other interesting observations. Here we have this graphic. they noticed that there was a natural progression from mutual titleless name to non-reciprocal titleless name, first name to mutual first name, right? So we have, for example, two people exchanging the title last name. And after, one of them is using the first name and receive the title last name. And in the third step, both of them use a mutual first name. And this figure shows the progression of address in time from left to right. They noticed that this progression cannot move backwards. For example, once a speaker has begun to use the first name, he will never use the title last name again with the same person, right? So only we have two exceptions. The first one is when using the address form to express anger, right? So if people are angry enough with someone, they usually address with first name, or they may use the title last name to symbolize the disruption in the relationship with the but when the issue that caused the trouble is resolved, so they return to use the first name, right? The second exception is when using multiple names. So Bron and Fold discovered that in friendship relationships, they address each other with multiple names, right? Like sometimes they say title last name, sometimes they use the first name or last name, or they use nicknames, right? So here the use of these more formal options like title last name or last name are not taken seriously. And then the use of the multiple name need to be reciprocal. Now we move to the study of Ervin-Tripp, 1972. She took a quite different approach to the study of American English Adress form the use of the American English Adress. She presents the address form system as a series of choices using the computer flowchart format. She finds valid a competent adult member of a Western American academic community, and she has developed a model for investigation address forms called flowchart model. Here we have the model address form for a competent adult member of the Western American academic community. So look at this chart. These diamond shaped junctures are to be taken as decision points, right? And the E, which is not clear, it's besides the juncture labeled adult, right? It marks the entry point, or the point where you begin the process. And we have two exits from each decision point, depending on whether the condition is met or not. When met, we have plus, and when it does not met, we have minus. So to work out the correct address form to use, you simply follow the appropriate path through the chart. And to illustrate this more, they have a good example was provided. Okay, an example of using Ervin-Tripp's model. Okay, so if we have a faculty member F, who wants to address the dean, D, would recognize him or her as an adult. Then check to see if he was status marked sitting, like a formal faculty meeting, for instance. If not, he will see whether or not F knows these names. D's name would be checked. Okay, and then whether or not D is a relative. Next, if decides if D is a friend or colleague. Then if D is a higher rank, then if it has a dispensation to address D by his first name. If not, then if has to decide if there is an identity set of occupational title like doctor or senator that applies dean plus last name in the absence of dispensation. Now let's see how Ervin-Tripp's notion is different from that from Bron and Fold. She calls for a decision about whether or not the other person is an adult. So her model calls for addressing any child by his or her name if you know it, and if you don't know the name, you don't use any name. And of course, Bron and Fold have data on children, but they have almost nothing to say about it. So there is no support or contradiction concerning this point. Also, her chart involves status marked sitting and whether or not the other person's name is known. But neither of these is mentioned in the earlier research. Bron and Fold mention generic first name like Mark or Buddy that we can use with someone we don't know the name. So in general, they are used when the addressee's name is not known. Of course, there are some points of agreement. For example, if the speaker is not an intimate term with the addressee, like he's not a friend or colleague, then some form of title last name will be used. Another point in common is that the rank precedes and dominates age as a criterion. So if the other person is of higher rank, the age juncture will not enter into the decision. Okay, so it's possible for a younger or lower status person to address an older or higher status person by first name, but only if there is a dispensation. So, which means that the older or the higher ranked person is privileged to decide how he or she will be addressed. Therefore, there are two situations under which a speaker might simply avoid using any name at all. The first one is, one case might be when conditions at one or other juncture is ambiguous. For example, you may not know if the other person consider your friendship to be close enough for you to use the first name, or perhaps you think you may have a dispensation to use higher status individual's first name, but you are not sure. And the other case is when the speaker simply doesn't know the other person's last name. Okay? But here, her model was flawed in that her chart leads us to use title like Mr. or Mrs. or Miss plus an empty last name. While it's normal to address a physician or a professor as doctor, but it's odd to address someone as just Mr. or Miss. Also, there are other considerable variation in address form usage across like language, the national boundaries, and also the social groups within the same community. So based on all these things, it becomes obvious that we can hardly predict exactly the form of an address that will be used by the speaker, even if the relationship between the speaker and the addressee is known. On the other hand, this variation makes research that leads to uniformity seems misleading. And so this is what my colleague will be talking about in the next part. Thank you.